Hello and welcome everyone to the next Foreman case study series. Your host Ken Gilvin here as always, and today I've got a long-time member of the Foreman community, but someone who's not so vocal on IRC usually. You pop up from time to time. So it's Matt Darcy. Welcome to the case study series.
Thank you.
Good to have you here, and we're gonna try and get through a few topics. So why don't we start by talking a little bit about you, Matt, and sort of where you fit into, what your background is, and how you use Foreman and where you came in.
Okay, so I'm a professional Unix consultant, have been for 16 years now, all the way back from the old sort of Solaris and HPUX days through to the early days of Linux in the enterprise world, and through to sort of the modern day, what people class as enterprise Linux now. My first introduction to Foreman was around when Satellite 5 and Spacewalk were not quite filling the needs, and we were having to hook into custom bits and bobs to try and get things working as they should do, or as we needed to do. And I stumbled across Foreman by accident then. It was in a pre-release stage, and I tried it out, and the concept was great. It wasn't quite ready for use, but it made me start following the project and see what was going on and how it got to where it is now. So I started looking for opportunities to use it at that point, and probably around the 1.4 release is when I probably first started using it properly in a production environment. I've used it in various methods. I've used it for a few educational facilities with roughly about 5,000 nodes in it, through to small councils. I know I can name 2 or 3 councils that are using it now with positive results, managing their variety of diverse Unix and Linux estates, which has turned out really well. And through to my first foray into using it in government, which is what we're talking about now.
Cool. So when you say councils, we're talking local government there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then the stuff we might talk about later is actually the UK government.
Correct.
Central government.
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting. But before we move on to that, let me just try and dig a little bit here. So so you mentioned that you're a consultant. You've worked on some big projects. Do you do much in terms of sort of tenancy stuff, where you want to segregate out different teams within an organization, or even entirely different organizations within one Foreman instance?
Yeah, it was one of the things that first was actually appealing when Satellite and Catella to a certain extent started offering the locations and the RBAC hosting groups, where yes, we've got things like where we'd want different roles within a project. For example, project team and a support team, and the project team disappears. We've got things like diverse integration with customers, so a customer team and a external team. So we've got quite interesting segregations I've used it with. Predominantly, it's been 2 or 3 different groups, though.
Cool, interesting stuff. So, and I mean, I guess as a consultant, you've had an opportunity to hit lots of different parts of the code base. So presumably, lots of different types of hardware. Well, servers, shall we say? Hardware implies physical, but yep, obviously, we don't all deal in physical these days.
Very true. So, yeah, absolutely. So it's been used as a hardware provisioner, which has been really good in terms of a box that provisions hardware that then builds that into a virtualization center. It's been used for virtualization on VMware, on KVM. It's been used on Rackspace, and I've used it now with EC2.
Cool. So you actually done the whole bootstrapping the cloud thing, where you build up the physical under cloud and then get the...
Yeah, it was actually a very good experience. We ended up with... We've done it twice. Once with a customer's box, we've built it up as like a high availability twin pair of Foreman boxes, and just deployed the proxies as the box is built, and then they became the controllers for the virtualization environment. And then we've done it actually with like a laptop using Foreman as a generic bootstrapper, where we just filled in a few parameters for the client's details, bootstrapped a couple of I think it was VMware at the time. Yeah, I think it was. We bootstrapped a couple. No, it wasn't online. It was the KVM boxes. We built the KVM boxes. I think it was 5 or 6 of them. Built them all into a nice little cluster. Deployed a few bits of storage behind them, and then that became the virtualization center. So even then, the Foreman nodes managed the virtualization cluster it just created, and then the VMs on top of it. It was a good experience.
Fantastic. That's actually a demo I want to build as well for taking to conference and things, where you do that whole build the data center thing. You know, you bring Foreman in as an appliance, get those first nodes up and running, get the infrastructure in place, get Foreman into that infrastructure, take over control of the nodes, and then move on and provision everything else. I think it's a really nice use case. It really demonstrates a lot of different parts of the project really nicely. So
it can certainly be taken a lot farther than we took it, which, you know, is really just testament to how much more it's got involved behind the scenes that you can use.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, you mentioned HA there as well, which is a bit of a hot topic, right? And you probably saw Chris's blog and case study from last year on that. Yeah. I'm interested. I don't want to divert too much from the advertised topic, but I mean, on the subject of HA, how far did you go with it? Was it literally just a couple of Foreman front ends to a shared database cluster, or were you
Pretty
doing?
much, yeah. There was limitations around it, as Chris's paper sort of shows that there's a lot you can do with it. There's a lot that at the time of writing you had to sort of, I won't say fight to get work, but it wasn't just a straight black and white situation. So we ended up with multiple proxies to create availability within the proxy world, and then we ended up with two Foreman servers and a shared database platform behind it, and then just really hitting a shared URL that accessed either one of them.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely some issues. The SSL is obviously the worst part, but yeah, it's, well, not the worst, but the most complex part to get right, with all the different layers of communication going on within the project. So that's cool. As I say, I don't want to get too diverted from what we said we were going to talk about, but I do think HA is something people are very interested in at the moment. I do want to get back to the SSL thing. I would like to try and either myself or find someone to write a blog, or even get it into the manual for using something like Let's Encrypt to replace all of the front-facing certificates. I think that'd be a really nice piece of documentation to have. Okay, so anyway, so let's. So you say you've been using this since 1.4 in production? Yeah,
I'd say that was probably the first basic setup we did, which I think was it was like a demo lab, really. Really just to see what it could do, but it was actually like a production demo lab, if you know what I mean. It wasn't a toy. It was deploying development environments.
It's not one VM on a host somewhere.
No. But it also wasn't something that if there was a problem, it wouldn't be a priority one incident with $300 million an hour going down the drain.
Yeah, indeed. Cool stuff. I mean, I know from chatting with you that you've been around in the community for older versions, but that's interesting to see. That's where it kind of reached. Was that the case of that was the first project it was suitable for? Or was that a case of that was the first time you felt it was stable enough?
I think there was a culmination of a lot of things. I think it was the first time that there was a project where it suited it very well. And when I looked at where it was within the release schedule, I thought, yes, that's got all the features I need without any fighting. It's been stable. It'd probably been stable for a good few releases before that, but I felt confident that the features were diverse enough to deliver what I needed, while also being pretty rock solid in that respect. So I think it was everything came together for that project. It wasn't that's the version I want to use. It was at that point of time, I think we're ready to try this.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. From my memory, and I am doing this from memory, so excuse any errors that I make. But from my memory, 1.4 was a really good stabilization release. Like 1.1, 2, and 3 each had something huge in it, right? And then 1.4 kind of really just sort of steadied the ship a little bit and brought it forward. And then obviously more big things came on further along. All right, well let's get on to what people are actually probably tuning in to talk about. So let's talk a bit about. I think let's do the government stuff first, and I think that's probably the smaller section from what we talked about before the show. So let's do that and get that kind of done. So obviously, government's an interesting thing. In a lot of ways, it's just another customer, but in a lot of other ways, it is really not another customer, right? And this applies to a number of industries. The same is true if you're working with the military or defense or anything like that, right? So what's your experience of trying to bring, I guess, something like an open source product that's going to control your whole network to government groups?
I think when we looked at doing this, or when I certainly looked at doing this and bringing it in for the first time, it was a very fortunate time where government was trying to diversify and not be locked into vendors, not be locked into hardware providers, not be locked into software providers with massive licenses, that have got you over a barrel. I think it was a time when open source technologies were being looked at very seriously. And the project I initially tried this on was in its very early days, but pretty much the concept that the government department involved had decided was everything must be open source, but with a support contract. So, for example, Red Hat rather than CentOS. So it's an open source platform, but it's got a commercial vendor behind it to back it and support it and drive it forward.
Someone to shout out when it breaks.
Yeah, that's part of it. That's part of it.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, but you can understand why companies want that. If they didn't, we wouldn't have an enterprise market at all, right?
Well, absolutely. When I look at the numbers involved in what the initial project was going to do in terms of financial, it was important that they had vendors behind them to support them to develop features if they needed them and things. So it was very much a conscious that we want an open source model where people can contribute to, people can see, even to the point where we can publish our code back and see if other people want to reuse it, but with a little bit of a safety net behind it. So I was at a fortunate time in that respect.
Interesting. And can you talk much about what the project actually entailed in terms of what sort of feature sets they're using and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is well, in terms of feature set, you mean within?
Well, I mean, what are we talking? Are they managing their desktops, or is this something specific?
Yeah. So the initial primary release of this was on a VMware-based platform, and it was approximately 500 or 600 servers, something along those lines. And it was for a web-based government application, which provided data collection, authentication, shared authentication, and provided services back to the UK public. So it wasn't like an internal, as you say, desktop or anything like that. It was a government online service. Okay,
interesting stuff. Now, I'm aware, I'll give a little background for our viewers who might not be from the UK, or maybe are and don't know about this. The government have a thing called GDS, the Government Digital Services, is that? Yeah. And they are huge on open source, right? I've come across them and chatted with them and things like that in the past. Was this a GDS project, or is this something else?
It's a very hard one to answer sort of clearly yes or no. It was what I'd say is a GDS principles project. So GDS themselves weren't hands-on doing work or involved in that respect, but the principles of what GDS had laid out, which is the sort of the digital government era, which, as you say, is very keen on open source and publishing your own code back and things like that, were the guiding principles that the project was built around.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, it's a case of there's a group within government who are keen on getting this done right, and they're trying to lay it down for everybody else. And it seems like the group you were working with were keen to do it that way, and that's very good for us. But what I found interesting, the reason I wanted to put this into the case study, is just that it's one of those rather interesting niche market, for the want of a better word, organization, industry, whatever you want to use, that people like to hear about, I think, because it's like, if you can get into those kinds of environments, it says something about your project, right? It says something about the maturity. It says something about how it's being used. And for some people, something being used by the big banks or the government means it's too old and we should have something new now. But a lot of the time, it's really interesting to know that it's suitable for so many different environments. So I just need to cough. Okay, that's better. Yay for mute buttons. So, okay, well, maybe we'll come back to, I guess the problem with this particular segment is that it's actually very difficult to ask questions that aren't just, what kind of industry is it, right? Which you could ask of anything. So I'm going to kind of keep that in the back of my head while we're talking. And let's move on to the EC2 side, because I think this is actually really interesting. We've had a lot of interest over the years in EC2. It's never been like the #1 platform. But it's always up there. People are always asking about it. If you look at our blog statistics and things like that, it's like that ancient blog post from 2012 about how to deploy an EC2 was like the highest rated blog post for years, even until this year. And I was so happy when one of our community members went and rewrote it for the most recent version of Foreman. It was like the best thing. So let's talk about your use of EC2 and where perhaps the sharp edges are and what works and what doesn't. So why don't you give us a bit of an overview of where you're at, and then we can dive in a little bit.
Sure. So as I said, the initial project was based on a VMware project, and as you said about the GDS stuff and the open standards and all that sort of thing, they decided to pick up and move that to a public cloud provider, which is a bold statement. And the public cloud provider was EC2. We looked at the possibility of using other technologies and different sort of approaches to what we wanted to do, which was in essence just a deployment, configuration, build, and management infrastructure around a project's needs. We looked at EC2 and we worked out that pretty much out of the box, everything we'd already done on the VMware platform was pick up and lift portable. So it meant we had to rewrite nothing almost from scratch. Everything was reusable. So our time to pick up and move was pretty much zero in that respect. To give you an idea, I think we sort of ported the whole estate and actually went live in about 3 months, which was, it's not a huge estate, but it's certainly enough to make it worth looking at. When we looked at the EC2 component of Foreman, we found out of the box, great, no problem whatsoever. I think we were on about 1.9 or something along those time. It worked out of the box. We used things like the Route 53 plugin to manage the Amazon DNS, which is a lifesaver. If anyone is considering using Foreman within EC2, the Route 53 plugin to have an active DNS record for your host is fantastic. It really is important. But that said, when we first started using it, we found quite a few problems with the earlier versions of the Route 53 plugin, in that it wasn't packaged as part of the Foreman repo. And when you look at it, there's a few little gem conflicts which didn't work, should we say, straight out of the box. It wouldn't do reverse DNS, so you could only update the forward DNS. It wouldn't quite hook into the reverse DNS, which an inconvenience, but certainly not the end of the world. And I think that's actually fixed in Foreman 12 now, 1.12. Thankfully, we had a good Ruby guy who was working with us, who sort of tidied a few bits and bobs up, and it worked great for us. Then as it moved forward into sort of like the 1.10 release, a lot of it came together. So we had problems with security groups not displaying. So when you provision a host, you're presented with a list of security groups that is available to that host, which is in essence your firewall rules. This would often be blank, and you'd have to do a lot of things like either refresh a few times to get them to come up, or to delete stop the provision and restart the provision to get it to look up. And what it turned out, it was basically the equivalent of a timeout. So that when it called off to Amazon, there was a call that said, "Get me the security groups, end." Whereas it was, instead of "Get me the security groups, wait a period of time and then end." That was pretty much the problem. It was like a timeout. I think that was fixed in 1.10 or 1.11. This allowed us to select the security groups, and from that point, it was pretty much easy sailing. There's a lot which I know you want to talk about around the auto scaling and the way to use that within Foreman, but out of the box, it was there as an early concept, no problems whatsoever. And up to I'd say 1.11, if you're looking at using 1.11 at the moment, it's a doddle. It's really very straightforward. Everything's ready out of the box. It's certainly very usable. There's room for improvement, but it's very usable. We used it as a host provisioner, really, in essence. So we provisioned a very, very stripped down AMI, very, very tiny, which boots up. We used Cloud Init with no user data. So it was like a finish script provision. So SSH provision finish script. Puppet then kicks in, and based on the host groups, provisions your node with the host type you've selected it for, which is very good. It's a very simple and straightforward process to use.
Cool. That's good to hear. And it's nice to know that those bugs got fixed and I don't have to go and look up the state of them for you. So that's good to hear. So yeah, I mean, you raised the really obvious question, and this comes up from time to time on the channel as well. And that's around auto scaling, right? It's the one thing we don't really do at all. And for me, from my perspective, I'm interested. I want to talk about your experiences and how you worked around it, so on. But I'm also interested. Maybe we'll come back to this point. But I'm also interested to know about how it should work, right? In general, how do you take something like Foreman, which is very focused at hosts, and make it work on slight things that are not quite hosts, like auto scaling? Okay, you can spin up new machines, have them registered to Foreman, that's fine, and then they are just hosts. But there's also the VPC itself, right? It's some kind of object. And you have a similar problem if you think about Docker. It goes the other way in Docker because you're spinning up very, very small things. Are they real hosts? I mean, it's like there's a few new types of object that we've got to learn how to deal with, which are not exactly hosts, but they're kind of close. And so I think there's some open questions there that we could maybe come back to. But let's start with the obvious question. Did you do anything with auto scaling? And if so, how did you do it?
So yes and no is the answer to that. I'd love to give you a yes or no answer to that, but it's a little bit more complex. So if Foreman has no awareness of Amazon availability zones and auto scaling. It deals with subnets, and that's pretty much it. When you define the VPC or your subnets, and you define either auto healing or auto scaling groups around that, there's just no way for Foreman to be aware of that at this time with the current EC2 plugin, or really any facilities around that. So we looked at two ways of doing this. We looked at building in the host, the auto scaling into the VPC and the groups as if you like Amazon recommendations, and then using Foreman Discovery to pick up nodes as Amazon provision them, and then change the node during the provision to match the node classification. The concept of that was fine. The reality of it wasn't great. That's partly probably due to our implementation rather than the failings of the discovery plugin, but it's certainly a way you could look at doing it.
Sorry, hang on. Let me just jump in there. Sorry to interrupt you. I try not to, but I'm terrible for this. I'm intrigued about the discovery bit. I mean, maybe that's something you're about to come to, but I'm really curious how you use discovery within an auto-scaling environment, since the whole idea of a discovery is there's a reboot part of the process, right?
Yeah. So we had the discovery plugin on there, and we had it basically hooked into a probe that, as a box came up, it would announce certain things we built into the finish script that as it came up, it would announce certain things to the Foreman webhooks.
Right.
And then discovery would pick that up and say, I've found this box. I'm aware of this box. I've got an entry for this type of. It was basically around hosting.
Right. I see where you're going with this. So what you're actually saying is it's got nothing to do with the discovery image, but instead you're replicating the API call that the image would make, and you're using the auto provisioning rules on the UI side.
Correct.
Interesting, and a very neat solution, actually, I have to say. So carry on.
So that was something that, if you like, worked for us, but it didn't work well enough, and possibly because we didn't do the best implementation of it, and with more time, we could get a better result out of that. But what we did find was a better result, and we currently have this in a proof of concept environment, which I'll explain why in a moment, was to use Amazon Lambda server. So Lambda server is like a messaging service that Amazon will fire message events into. So if you've got an auto-scaling group of, say, or an auto-healing group of, say, 3 servers, and you've only got 2 in there, Amazon, rather than provision the third box, will send a message to the Amazon Lambda service, which will then translate that message into a signal that we can send into the Foreman webhook that says, please provision one more web node, which is relevant to host group. And that actually, as a technology solution, works very well. So you basically, your auto-scaling rules are defined by node type and things like that. Mm-hmm. And instead of Amazon actually spinning up the node for you, it sends it to Lambda, and Lambda calls Foreman and says, please provision me this node.
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard of the Lambda server stuff. There's too many things to keep tabs on, right? And that's
cool. So panel things daily, so there's no way you'll ever hear it.
So sorry, one sec. So let me just clarify. So the Lambda service, that's an extra thing that you can add on to your console and in Amazon. It's a service.
It's a standard Amazon service.
A standard Amazon service. So you get that one.
Absolutely. So it's like the same as like RDS, SQS.
Right. Cool.
It's just an Amazon black box.
Brilliant. But instead, instead of them just automatically doing it for you, they sort of give you that ability to hook in and do whatever you actually want to solve the auto healing problem that you currently have.
Correct. So it's almost really like a proxy layer.
That's really nice, and I would be very interested to see more detail on how that's all working once you're happy with it.
Absolutely. So we're actually very happy with the solution. The reason it's only stuck in a test environment at the moment is due to an Amazon restriction, which I believe is going to be resolved very soon, but I don't know for certain, which is a lot of Amazon services, I'm sure you're aware, present themselves on public IPs only. Mm. And you have to either lock them down with things like Amazon keys or security groups and things like that. Lambda is one of these services where it presents itself on a public IP address, whether you like it or not. There's no such thing as an internal Lambda service.
Right.
Which means for Foreman to be able to interact with it, or for it to interact with Foreman, you have to give something that's basically a public internet service a route into your network.
Yeah, not ideal.
Which, as you said, going back to the government things and the restrictions they can apply, because they take it very seriously, that's not something that we can just do overnight. So at the moment, we're trying to look at ways to sort of proxy that in, or reverse NAT that in, or even allow it in safely. While at the same time, Amazon are suggesting that there will be an internal Lambda service in the very near future.
So one of these things is going to get sorted sooner or later. Yeah.
One way or another, yes.
Yeah.
But we're looking at all options, really.
But that's really interesting, and I know I'm going to be really interested to talk with some of the other people who I've spoken to in the past about VPC stuff, because that sounds to me like a really elegant solution. Like,
it works.
Yeah, because that was always my question, was always that, okay, I get the idea of a VPC, but now you've got 2 things capable of provisioning as part of your infrastructure, right? and they're always going to have a bit of a fight. It's a translation of the classic package manager question, like, do you install your packages with RPM, with Yum, or do you do it with Gem or Node? It's are you back?
Sorry, my
just plugging in. So yeah, there's always these kind of problems wherever you have two things capable that are designed to do the same thing, right? It's a fundamental issue. So that always felt to me like that was always going to be a bit of a problem. It's like, how do you take that away from Amazon? It sounds like they've already had that idea and given you the option. So that's really cool.
There's a political argument around that as well, though. Obviously, Amazon have their way of doing things, so they enable you to extend your functionality off their services, which is great. And as a result of that, you can do things with Foreman, such as the auto scaling idea. But obviously, then there's the fight that there's the Amazon way. Amazon like you to use their tools. So as you say, there's a conflict there, both technology-wise and perhaps politically-wise, about how how to take it forward.
Sure, but then even just the solution you outlined using discovery was really interesting, and I think that is really interesting. Not necessarily so much for Amazon, but you can translate that to any system where you've got some kind of auto provisioning in place, right? I mean, that's quite nice.
Well, to give you an example of that on a non-Amazon estate, we simulated auto scaling, not so much auto healing, but auto scaling with Nagios. So basically, when Nagios detected a failure or detected a host that was stressed for a certain amount of time under a certain metric was met, it would throw exactly the same thing, provision an empty box, and then the discovery agent would pick that up and classify it based on where it was provisioning it and how it was provisioning it, and write it in.
So I did have one interesting question. If you're hitting the API, if you're replicating what the discovery image does, why do it through discovery? Why not just make an API call to create a new host?
Because what's going to make the API host the actual call?
Sure. I mean, the machine's already been provisioned, and that's the one making the call, right? But you could still create the host in Foreman directly, because presumably what's happening is you've got, if I understand you correctly, the machine gets provisioned by Amazon as part of the auto healing process.
Yep.
That comes up, and it itself registers into Foreman as a discovered host.
Yep.
The discovery system picks that up and says, okay, I've got a rule that matches that, I'm going to provision it. Now, what it thinks it's just done is send a reboot call to the machine, which obviously does nothing because it's not actually a discovery image. And then it becomes a standard host in the Foreman UI, right?
Correct.
But you could just create a host in the Foreman UI directly with that API call. Yeah,
absolutely. So I say our implementation of it, the concept of what we were doing was fine, but we hit limitations around our implementation with it, and some of the restrictions around how we could work. There is more to do on the discovery option, which would allow you to do what we're talking about, doing it a lot easier and a lot better. But we went with the Lambda option because that seemed the more, I won't say friendly approach, but it seemed the more it just seemed the better approach, because you were getting legitimate Amazon calls and it was provisioning on demand rather than manipulating something that Foreman didn't know about.
No, I agree entirely. Within Amazon, that Lambda solution is lovely. I think that's really, really nice. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of before you had the option of the Lambda thing.
Oh, just learning experience.
Sure. So all I would say is if for any reason you end up back at that coal face, I would say that it sounds like you could make a different API call and just register the host directly.
There is no doubt in my mind we could do it better. The results we got were very good. They were just it was a lot of work to get what we wanted, and probably because of that's how we approached it rather than the limitation.
Sure. I mean, it's not a bad solution at all, and it's a very creative use of the discovery rules and quotas system, which I think is very cool. And it's nice to see that. I mean, when I first saw that quota stuff that Lukasz did, I was blown away. It's just so good. But yeah, it was one of those things that I was like, what else is this going to get used for? And I think in this case, what I don't know, I guess I don't know enough about Amazon, is I don't know how important it is that the rules get used to provision into different systems. Because as far as I can tell, does the host know what it's going to be? Like, if you've got an auto-healing group, are they all identical?
No.
Right. So the important thing here is that you're getting them into a host group, right? That's the bit that's important.
Which is what really classifies them.
Right. And so here, then for that perspective, I don't think there's a difference between using Discovery or using the API directly, because obviously you can specify a host group in the API call to create a host.
Yeah.
So yeah. And I guess the other interesting question is, how did you handle certificate management there for like getting it connected to Puppet and things like that?
If I remember rightly, it was the AMI we used had no certificate awareness at all, so it wasn't along those lines. And we had a custom snippet that generated based on the rules, and the finish script. So when it hooked in, we had a custom snippet that basically dropped the null certificate that it sort of failed to create and recreated it and forced the Puppet run on it. And the forcing of the Puppet run is what recreated the certificate and hooked it into Foreman, which then all actually triggered the rules from the host group to be sort of applied.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And what? Sorry, was that with the Lambda? That's with the Lambda though, because you're provisioning it and getting the finish script to run.
That's right.
Yeah. So from the Discovery side, then that's the other. So also we've got two competing methods. I'm just trying to understand how both of them work. That's fine, because that's useful. That's useful information as well. I'm trying to understand them both. So.
That's how we did it on Discovery. From the Lambda side, it's not a problem because Foreman creates the node for you. So Foreman makes
That's what I thought. Sorry. So let me clarify then. On the Discovery side, how is the finish script getting run? Because there's no provisioning process, right?
So the finish script is getting run by a cheat. So again, it was all about the hooks we had in the AMI we were using. Right. So basically, we called it down and ran it.
Of course, because the host is going to be put into build mode, isn't it?
Correct.
When Discovery moves it over to being a real host, it also puts it in build mode, which will give you access to the templates.
And this goes back a little bit to the fact that our implementation wasn't the best. The idea was sane, but
no, absolutely, because that was actually that's a really good point. Although again, there are other ways to achieve it, obviously, as you've already said yourself. But that's a really interesting point, because actually, whilst there is no difference between using a discovery rule to get to a host group or just supplying the host group in the API call, it does help you a little bit with that provisioning step of trying to get things to run. It's quite interesting. So
the discovery thing is something that I definitely revisit again with a little bit more experience and a little bit more hindsight, and I think you could get best results out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's all sorts of interesting ways to work around that, but certainly the idea of, if you're in another system, so this Lambda thing is very cool, and I think in the Amazon world, that seems to be the most elegant solution. Now that I've learned about it,
plugin would be something that's good for that. You know, the Lambda plugin that could accept and handle those events for you, rather than have to sort of encode the Lambda events into the hook calls it made.
Yes, that would be nice to see, actually. Just an extension of it doesn't even need much in the way of UI. It would just be an extension of the API to take whatever Lambda fires at it and work with it internally. That would be quite cool to see. I agree. But to return to my point, if you're on Amazon, that's great. If you're on another system, I think, for example, there's some of this I think there might be some of this in OpenStack. There's definitely if you look at more containery type places like OpenShift and things like this, you've definitely got auto-scaling stuff there as well. So wherever you don't have some kind of service that you can rely on like Lambda, then at least you have this fallback idea of getting it in via some other route. So that's really interesting stuff. So we did have a question, but I think we've covered it already, just talking about whether the discovery rules are actually critical here. And as I think we said, they work very well, but you could create host groups directly.
Yep.
So that's cool.
I think they're critical for our solution, how we approached it, but I don't think they're critical for a solution that would work this way.
Yeah, I think that's the key way of putting it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool. So let me just see what else I've got on my EC2 notes here. So you mentioned the Route 53 plugin very briefly, but I think we've said, did we say everything we need to say about that? Just basically it works apart from reverse DNS.
Yeah, and I think the reverse DNS is working. I think now that in 1.11 or 1.12, I can't remember the exact version, it's now built and packaged properly. Which I can't remember the gentleman's name. Thank you for him. He put it into the auto build process for it, so that was great. And that just makes using it really easy. It's really as simple as setting up a domain in Foreman, give it an Amazon private key and secret password, and you're done.
Cool, that's good. How do you find? I'm gonna go off script slightly here because I just had a thought. obviously back in around about 1.8, we completely changed how interfaces were handled in Foreman and split it out and allowed you to have lots of nice multiple interfaces and so on. But it did have a bit of an impact on the sort of more, if I can put quotes on this, the cloudy kind of providers, right, where you're not really creating interfaces. And in general, it's okay, but it's not brilliant. How did you find interacting with the sort of new interfaces form on EC2?
The new interface as an overall layout change, or an enhancement, is very good. As we've discussed it before in the past, it was a good step forward. In terms of how it operated with an EC2 or generic cloud provider, it was fine from a manual interaction. If you wanted to build a host, just clicking through the options and things like that, it was actually very simple and very clear and straightforward. The automation capabilities around it, so for example, tying in, selecting a domain name based around a Puppet environment, for example, didn't work so great. And I think that's more to do with the dependencies on things like the Route 53 plugin and things like that. It's not hooked in quite as packaged as tightly as it could be at this moment in time.
Yeah, that's my gut feeling as well. And I think it depends. It strongly depends which platform we're talking about. And I think for some it works okay, and for others it really struggles.
I think EC2 is probably the most extreme example of it not working as well as it could. And to clarify, not working as well as it could, it is still working 100% functionality wise. It just requires maybe a click or two extra when in an ideal world you wouldn't have to make those clicks.
Yeah, it's just it's very physical focus, and that was necessary because obviously pre 1.8 we only could have one proper interface for a host. You could register others, but they were just informational, right? And that's fine when you only have a cloud provider that pretty much only provides you with one interface anyway. So it didn't matter. But then, we took that away and we made it much more physical focus, where you've got, 4 NICs on your box and 2 bonds and all the rest of it. And that kind of, had some implications that we've not really done very much about. It works fine most of the time, but just occasionally you find things that don't. And the worst culprit for this is not EC2, it's OpenStack, because OpenStack moves very quickly.
Actually, just for your information, we found it worked very well on the VMware platform the legacy platform we were on before we ported to EC2. The upgrades I think it was 1.9 was the first time we sort of really noticed it working, as you say, and that was probably the last version we had on the VMware platform for this project. And because we had 4 interfaces on a box, so the fact that those 4 interfaces were available and we could populate them and we could assign them, for example, to the DHCP scope, to the DNS proxy and things like that was great. So it worked very well on VMware. I think it just doesn't glue together on probably a more extreme example like EC2.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely those very sort of those platforms where you are not really expected to manage the sort of details that are relevant to an interface, the IP addresses, the subnets, etc. Not so much domains, which are obviously still relevant, but yeah, then it starts to kind of go a bit weird. So it'll be interesting to see maybe what we can do about that in the future. I have no data that we might, but it's an interesting discussion. So that's good. That's cool. Let me just see what else we've got on our list. Do you use many plugins?
So we used, as you said, we've used the Discovery plugin. We used Route 53. We've got on our test system, we've got the branding plugin. The branding
plugin, interesting. I mean, there's not much to say about it for people watching who aren't perhaps familiar with it. It's exactly what it says it is. It's a plugin for branding your instance of Foreman, and it's pretty good, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at Foreman as an interface, there's only so much you can change, but the branding plugin allows you to pretty much change all that's in front of your eyes. So, it's a really good feature, and it gives a nice warm wrapper feeling to the people using it. You feel like it's built something for you. It's in their colors, so they can integrate like links into their intranet, and it all looks the same and things like that. So, although it doesn't give you a massive technical bonus, it gave a much better presentation of the work that was being done.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. When you're pushing for adoption in bigger environments, that matters surprisingly much, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used the plugin, the branding plugin for that, and sort of positive feedbacks. And I think we're about to change the branding on it as well. And
that'll be obviously very easy.
Absolutely.
So, anything else?
For this project, I can't think of anything else off the top of my head.
Fair enough.
Obviously the reporting plugins and got some of the sort of custom reports running again, just for the same thing that people like to see the state of their environment. They like to see the Puppet runs complete. They like to see all that. So yeah,
cool.
But nothing that's not out of the box stock.
Cool. Okay. No, that's interesting. I know we talked a little bit about that. Well, that's really cool stuff. I'm really so I think, just to sum up, I think I'm really interested to hear more about the solutions around this kind of auto scaling stuff, because it does apply to other platforms, and perhaps we could talk later about a blog post or something like that once you're happy with whatever solutions you go with, because I think that's the sort of information that's useful to people. And
having Foreman now in EC2 for sort of a good sort of, it must be a year now, in like a production class environment, I think there's some sort of very minor changes that we've started looking at the possibility of committing back upstream to Foreman to help allow things like the EC2 functionality, and I think it'd work well for things like OpenStack as well for similar things, to try and make it a little bit more cloud friendly. And I think the same is true of things like such as the Lambda example or the discovery methods of using that a bit simpler out of the box, so that they don't have to go through the perhaps messy learning stage we did.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, that would be very welcome. Obviously, I'm kind of being who and what I am for the community. I'm generally bound to say anything is good. But if I were to pick a couple of things, I would say some write up in some form of how you solve these problems would be very interesting, I think, for people to read. And then, yeah, as you say, contributions are always massively welcome, and that as we talked about earlier, perhaps a plugin for the Lambda service, and perhaps even, like as you say, just we can maybe take it to the dev list and talk a little bit about where we might be able to improve the UI and things like that. But
it's really easy, simple things like the IP subnets. So it displays a list of IP subnets. That's great. However, Amazon also has a comments field which allows you to define the subnets by name, which makes things a lot easier. So like a second box around that as a plugin alteration to display the name rather than the IP.
Sure. I think that's perfectly fair, and that's the kind of feedback we never hear. That's why one of the reasons I like doing these case studies is not just for the new people coming into the community who are looking for things that match their use case and then go and watch those case studies, but also it's an opportunity to chat with people and find out this kind of feedback that unless you really push for it, you don't hear it, right? So this is.
I don't think I'd have had as much awareness of it. If you look at it and you just build a few boxes, it's great. It's really good. If you use it and hand off to a support organization or hand off to people who are using first, second, and third line with different levels of capabilities, you sort of start to find the gaps or the things that could be improved over a year of using that. When you sort of see that the new guy's struggling with X, Y, and Z, the experienced guy's struggling with something different, not because it's wrong, just because he's not used to that way and things.
Yeah, and that's exactly my point. Is that you can get the broken stuff really quickly, and that's fine. But then, yeah, those little kind of UI quirks where things are not quite right are harder to get to. So this is really good feedback, and that's really useful. So we're running nice and smoothly on time. So let's just wrap up a little bit. Let's do the usual kind of. I do this kind of standard thing with the case studies where we just talk a little bit about the project and where it's at and so on. So obviously taking EC2 to one side for a minute, because we spent all of the last 20-25 minutes on that. What would be your sort of top thing about Foreman as a whole, not just the code base, but anywhere from within the sort of the whole project?
So the speed factor of the development. So from where it's come from to where it is today is probably one of the most impressive things I've seen. As you say, you've celebrated your 10th birthday.
Seventh birthday,
sorry, apologies. From looking back where it was when I first sort of picked it up and first started looking at it, which was sort of the early days of pre-release, to where it is now, it's come an awful long way, and it's adapted from being a box builder and provisioner and configuration management to being an enterprise management tool now. And when you look at all the plugins and the features on it and how quickly they move and how quickly they pick up new support for new features or new technologies, I see that you've integrated the Ansible stack, which that was massively useful to us as a starting point, because we manage our EC2 instance with Ansible scripts. So that was a great example. Chef's in there a lot more prominent now. Docker containers are in there. It's moving along. So the movement from where it was to where it is now, the pace and the attitude of why it's done it is probably the sounding thing for me. That's the thing that, you know, it makes it worth following and being part of the project.
That's really, really good answer. Thank you very much. Well, on the Ansible thing, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a new release just last week, I think, which has support for Ansible roles now. So you might want to.
I'm running it in my home lab at the moment.
Already running it? Fantastic. Any words for Daniel on that one? Is it working well for you?
Thank you. Other than thank you at the moment, I've not. I've only done a few basic tests, but it looks all right from what I've tested so far.
Fantastic. I'm sure he'll be pleased to hear it. He usually watches them live, so we'll see if he comments while we're chatting. So cool. I'm very glad to hear that's working well for you. It does seem obviously hugely popular, and I think that there's no surprise around that, right? Ansible fulfills a need because it's not quite the same kind of tooling as ShareForce, Salt, or what have you.
It bridges a gap.
Exactly, and there's no surprise that it's so popular. What's that? Croaky throat, not good. So, all right, that's the good point. What would be your standout kind of paper cut thing you'd fix, maybe feature you'd drop, something along those lines?
I think it's a hard one because as a tool set, it's a great tool set, and I'd say it's always growing, so there's always more coming in. I think they sort of the two things that sort of stick out, and they're linked together really, are the speed of release, which can be great, but to keep on top of that and keep up to date and things like that, that can be quite a challenge. For example, as we spoke earlier about the sort of restrictions of a government project, for example, they don't want a production system that's changing every 3 months, for example, with a major release change. And that ties into the dependencies. So, like, for example, 1.13 will drop RHEL 6 support because of the dependencies being hard to be met, which is very understandable. But if you look at, you know, a lot of big businesses at the moment are still using things like RHEL 6. So the limitations around sort of depending on the SCL packages and the older operating systems, which, while, you know, a guy using them on a day-to-day basis may consider old, the guy managing a huge bank, you know, may consider stable. They're two different very approaches, and I think that's a very hard line for Foreman to tread, while bringing in new features and keeping up to date, which requires new technologies, without dropping the old platforms, which, you know, when you get called into a situation, you find yourself running on.
It's not just new features either. Security becomes a major problem.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, because even though the language itself is committed to be maintained by RHEL, it doesn't mean all the gems that you rely on can be updated, right? As the libraries you rely on will release new versions that no longer work on old Rubies, right? So it gets increasingly hard. You're right; it's a difficult one to walk. There's no easy answer, right? You kind of have to pick one and stick with it. So, but I hear you, and I hear it from other people as well. That our kind of solution to that, I guess, if I wanted to get defensive, is to try and bomb-proof that upgrade process as much as possible, right?
Absolutely.
That's the bit that matters. It should be.
And the experience has always been very good. It's not a Foreman problem. It's more a problem because the way Foreman works in itself is in, like, as you say, the language is being maintained, new features coming in, new technologies. You know, there's going to be someone who wants something that depends on a later gem that requires 500 dependencies to backport it to RHEL 6.
It's not going to happen, is it? And I think even if we could make every upgrade trivial and bomb-proof, it still wouldn't be the right choice for some enterprise customers, because they don't want to go and rewrite all their training material, right? Because, I mean, let's look at the recent release. We changed from Bootstrap to Patternfly, right? Nothing functionally, really, apart from the smart proxy page, changed in that release. Everything was still where you left it, but it looked completely different, and all your screenshots are out of date. So, you know, people don't like that.
And that maybe ties into the fact that the major releases are rolling, they roll very quickly, which
that's what I'm saying,
delighted with, because I've seen the features grow and I've really benefited from those features grow. But the other half of me, sort of, it's harder for me to then go justify to a support organization saying a rolling change request of every 3 months, for example.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, you can stretch it to 6 months, obviously, because we support X release and X-1.
Yeah.
So theoretically, you can do a jump upgrade every other release.
Yeah.
So that's one possibility, and then there's an obvious other possibility, right? So so
that's not so much a complaint, but it's more a failing of Foreman success.
Yeah. Yes. Scalability is a nice problem to have. Okay. Cool. Well, we are running out of time slowly. Well, actually, at the same. We're not moving at the speed of light, so at the same time as everybody else, I guess. But we're going to wrap it up. Do you have any final sort of shout outs or anything you want to do?
No, not at all. The people I've worked with on my current project, David Kirk, Craig Reeves and Sampson, all that sort of Stuart Herbert, they're probably the ones who've benefited from the Foreman experience and help take it forward. They're the ones who've come in with these ideas and solutions as well. So I thank the people I work with on the EC2 project because it's opened my eyes to a lot more possibilities within the Foreman world.
Cool. All right then. Well, in that case, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for your time. It's been really interesting chatting with you today. For everyone else out there, let me. I should put up the closing slide, really, shouldn't I? That would be a good thing to do if we're going to wrap up. So let me do that. So yeah, this has been the latest entry in the Foreman case study series. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Matt. If you do enjoy today's video, guys, then please do give me a +1 on the YouTube video or subscribe to the channel to know when we're doing more stuff. You can also find us on Twitter, and you can obviously come to our website and see our events page and see what's going on in the community. In the meantime, thank you all for watching, and do take care.